Well, I'm delighted to be back here. I really had a great time teaching my course a couple of weeks ago, and I hope you did too. All right, so the paper that I'm going to present today is some work in progress with Greg Kaplan and Ben Moll. It's called The Great Lockdown, Macroeconomic and Distributional Effects of COVID-19. And the topic is, as clear from the title, basically the economic consequences of the virus. Okay, so what we do in this paper, we're kind of interested in the global outbreak of COVID-19, which happened in first quarter of 2020 around the world. And in particular, there are kind of three key aspects of this phenomenon that are kind of germane, I think, to the US, but also to many other countries' experiences. The first one is the epidemic itself. The epidemic, as we all know from personal experience, transformed the patterns of consumption and labor supply. The second aspect is the lockdown, what is being called in the US at least the Great Lockdown. So the economy was literally frozen for a couple of months. It was necessary from the point of view of like public health policy, but it was clearly very painful economically. The third aspect that is also common to probably most countries, most developed countries, and I believe also developing countries, is the fact that many governments intervened quite heavily with fiscal policy. In the US, there was what is called the CARES Act, and there is another one which is right now under discussion because many of the most important aspects of the CARES Act have expired. And in general, this fiscal policy intervention aimed at kind of cushioning the economic losses from the crisis. All these three aspects, the epidemic, the lockdown, and fiscal policy, they clearly had like major macroeconomic consequences, but also distributional consequences. And the key question that we address in this paper is how large and how unequal are the effects of these sort of three dimensions of the outbreak of COVID-19: the epidemic, the lockdown, and the fiscal policy. So there are, as you all know, a few macro papers already in the literature, and if you want to think about like one original novel dimension of our contribution here, is that our angle is really is on distribution and inequality. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to do in the rest of the 90 minutes. So how do we do it? So we're going to develop an integrated framework to study jointly the dynamics of the epidemic and the macroeconomic and distributional consequences of the epidemic, the lockdown, and the policy response. So we combine an SIR model with an heterogeneous agent model. There has, the SIR block is to study the dynamics of an epidemic. The heterogeneous agent model is a relatively standard model of the one, the fact that I have taught a couple of weeks ago with the following extensions. The first one is that we have different occupations and so multiple occupation and multiple sectors, and the second is that we have kind of this two-way feedback between infection risk and economic activity. Okay, so infection risk is going to affect economic activity through sort of behavioral response, and economic activity is going to affect infection risk just because the number of people who interact with each other can increase or decrease based on the degree of economic activity. Okay, we also another kind of key feature of the analysis is some empirical work. We document that empirically the workers were in occupation that are most exposed to the shock are also the ones with lower earnings and lower liquid wealth to income ratios. Okay, so they're also the most vulnerable. So basically the workers are most exposed, they're also the most vulnerable. And that is important when you think about the distributional implications of this shock. We calibrate the model to the US economy, so we're interested in the US economy, but the framework can potentially be applied to any other country pretty much with a different calibration. And we examine both actual events, in particular, the actual dynamic of the epidemics, the actual lockdown, and the actual fiscal policy, but also counterfactuals. We do some counterfactuals. In particular, we look at we study what we call the laissez-faire, which is essentially a scenario where the government does nothing in terms of either public policy interventions or fiscal policy. We study lockdowns of different intensity, different type, different lengths, and different fiscal policies. Right now, what we're doing, I just got some results today, but I wasn't able to introduce them incorporate in the presentation, but I'm happy to talk about it later. We are analyzing like more targeted, sort of smarter, so to speak, health and economic policies. So let me give you a preview of what we find, and then I'll stop for questions. We have like 5 kind of main results, 5 main findings. The first one is that both the epidemic and the lockdown, they hit the poor households the most, okay? Which is consistent with some kind of empirical analysis done by these authors here. This means that welfare losses are large on average, and it also means that, and I'll explain it later, that they're large for both the epidemic itself and the lockdown, but there are notable differences in the distributional impact of the laissez-faire and the lockdown scenarios. Okay, so they all have large welfare losses, but the distribution is kind of different. The second finding is that I think we're the first paper that distinguishes 2 really key dimensions of the lockdown. Okay, there was a lockdown in the social sector, okay, which was kind of shut down. Okay, restaurants were shut down, gyms were shut down, and so on. But also, all the non-essential business was locked down. Okay, these are 2 aspects that are kind of very different, and we model them both separately. And we show that the social sector lockdown offers a better trade-off than the workplace lockdown. Okay, I will explain it clearly. We also draw what we call a pandemic possibility frontier in the space of kind of life saved and economic cost. And we make the point that this pandemic possibility frontier has actually, it doesn't have a uniform slope, as a very uneven slope, and I will explain why the slope changes. It's kind of interesting. Turning to fiscal policy, we show that US fiscal policy reduced welfare losses by roughly 20% without increasing debts. In fact, for a subtle reason I will explain, debts also are slightly reduced when the CARES Act is implemented in the model. Also, the model replicates, that's the final finding for now, replicates the empirical finding in the literature that the consumption of the poor has recovered much more quickly than the consumption of the rich. And the reason in the model, we make it very clear, is purely the income support from fiscal policy that has been very generous in the US. Okay, those are the main findings. Let me just tell you what we don't do, and then I'll stop and move on to the model. We don't have a differential impact to the epidemic across age groups. Okay, so it's easy to add in the model, but this is something that's been analyzed, and I think it's very clear out there by a number of authors already. So we didn't feel the need to study that particular trade-off. Also, we don't have differential impacts of the epidemic across gender, even though we know from various papers that that's clearly out there, and it's an important dimension. we abstract from the impact of the epidemic on deaths from other causes. Okay, so we know that basically, because economic activity fell, the death rate fell consequently, but also because people are very reluctant to go to hospitals, death rates increase for other reasons. So we know that, but we are not really looking at that particular dimension. We also, in the production structure, we are abstracting from input-output linkages, network structure that are important, abstracting from firm balance sheets and liquidity provisions to firms. Our model of the firm is kind of neoclassical, very simple. And we are also, because we don't have like search component in the model, we're also abstracting from like, this issue that is kind of important in the policy design, that in absence of policy, there may be like costly destruction of viable employment relationship, and destruction of like firm-specific human capital and so on. These are all things that obviously are important. I mean, this is like a really big question if you consider all the different aspects. This is not in the presentation. Okay, so that's my introduction. Why don't I stop and if there is any question?
There's no questions, Gianluca.
Okay, very good. So, okay, excellent. So I'm gonna move on to the model. Okay. So let me give you a first quick overview first of all. Okay, so the AP block basically it's an SEIR model, so susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered, where we add a critically ill state, okay, an ICU state, which is important because there's going to be an ICU constraint in the model that sometimes binds, sometimes doesn't bind, and depending on whether it binds or not, the death rate can be really amplified. We also allow the infection rate to depend on economic activity, as I explained. Households, they face uninsurable idiosyncratic labor market risk, and they face obviously health risk, the risk of getting infected and dying conditional infection. They hold two assets, liquid and illiquid assets, so it's a standard like two-asset model in that respect. They consume three goods. They consume what you call the regular good, the social good. The regular good, think of this as being essentially everything that is not in the social good sector, and social good sector will be what talking about it earlier. So like restaurants, gyms, and so on. I'll be very precise about the definition later. And then the third good is home production. The social good is basically any good whose consumption kind of necessitates social interaction, okay? Either with workers or with other individuals, other customers. The third good is home production, which is important in the analysis, in the macroeconomic analysis, because it's fairly good substitute of the social good. Households also supply three types of labor. They supply labor in the workplace or on-site labor, remote labor, and home labor. That's going to map one-to-one into home production. The feedback goes also the other way. Okay, so we talked about the feedback from economic activity to the infection rate, but also we have the feedback going the other direction, meaning that the on-site work and consumption choices, they depend on the infection rate. Okay? In particular, going to depend on the, in fact, on the death rate directly. It's also key in the model, excuse me, in the production structure of the model, the occupational structure is key. We're going to, assume as in reality that some workers in some occupations, they really cannot work remotely, or if they do, this comes at a very, very large cost in terms of productivity, which generates kind of a labor supply effect from the shock. Also, there are some workers, some occupations that are primarily employed in the social sector. They are going to take a big hit, obviously, from the virus because households cut sharply their demand for the good, and so that's kind of a labor demand effect for these occupations. And we're also going to distinguish between essential and non-essential occupation that is really important for the modeling of the lockdown, what the lockdown does. Okay, that's kind of the overview of the key features of the model. So again, if there's no other question.
Gianluca, I have a question.
Yeah.
There's gonna be any kind of relationship between, for instance, the guys or workers that cannot work remotely are guys that maybe are less productive, and also maybe guys that do not have assets or savings. So it's going to be something like this that
yes, it's going to be, yes. We're going to calibrate the model to match the earnings distribution, so therefore basically the productivity distribution across occupations, and also the correlation between occupational status and liquid wealth, okay, in a way that I will describe in the calibration. So these are all features that are going to be in the model, and they're key. And they're key because, as I said earlier, these occupations which are the most exposed to the shock are going to be also the most vulnerable from the point of view of like consumption smoothing. Okay, so let me describe quickly the SIR model. Okay, so the model has is one of these sort of standard compartmental models of the AP literature, where there are essentially 5 groups: susceptible, exposed, infectious, critical, and recovered individuals. Okay, so any individual can be in one of these like 5 states. A susceptible individual is an individual that is kind of vulnerable to being hit by the virus. An exposed individual is an individual that has been infected, but the virus is still latent. Okay, so the individual is not yet infectious. Then the individual becomes infectious, and the dynamics of the infectious individuals are key for the spread and the dynamics of the epidemic. An infectious individual with some probability can become critical. Okay, every infectious individual becomes sick eventually, but but we all know that some of the by now that many actually estimates like around a third of individuals kind of asymptomatic, so they almost have no symptoms. Some are mildly sick, but then some of them become really critically ill, and they need an ICU. So they enter an ICU, and these are the only individuals that may ultimately die with some probability. Many individuals they do recover, and once they are recovered, they are not susceptible anymore. But it's really easy. In fact, we allow in the model for a flow probability from the recover back to susceptible, so on, which means that essentially you're not immune forever. Okay, so this is the way that the dynamic system for these kind of 5 states work. This is like the Markov chain that determines the transitions. I don't want to get into all the details, but essentially, you can see that there are some key parameters here. One of the key parameters is beta, which is the transmission rate of the disease. I'll come back to the dynamics of this beta, the modeling of the beta later. The other parameter that is quite important is the death probability. As I said, essentially, this death probability here that occurs when you are critical, that is relevant when you're critical, depends on whether the aggregate number of critical ill individuals, so the individuals that they need an ICU, is above or below this number Cmax, which is the max IU capacity. there is a max ICU capacity in the economy. Okay, in the US is about 60,000 ICU units. If the number of critically ill people is above, then the death rate can be much larger for someone who's critically ill, because basically with some probability you don't have access to an ICU, and we assume that you die with probability 1 in that case. Okay. The population size is NT, which is kind of the sum of all these different types, and we assume that N0, so the initial size population, is 1. Okay, any question? Any question on this? I mean, this is sort of, if you've seen these models, this is kind of standard with the addition of the critically ill. All right, very good. So this beta, the transmission rate, is going to be a function of the total amount of social consumption, the total amount of labor supply in the workplace, okay, and time. It's an exogenous function of time because there's an element I'm going to talk about of exogenous change in the transmission rate. Okay, in the calibration section, I'll come back to this. Okay, but you see here you see the feedback basically from economic activity into infection. Okay, beta is an increasing function of CNN, obviously.
Sorry, I have a short question.
Sure.
So the Cmax, so this is the capacity in of ICU beds. Does this change along the epidemic?
We assume it's constant at 60,000 units. But there are data that are updated. They've been updated actually very frequently. So we can go back and see whether there's been a significant change. That's actually a good point. I don't think,
because for example, here in Chile, it increased like by 400 times, something like that. It was.
Oh, really?
So in Santiago, the ICU beds went from like 400 to more than 1,600, something like that. So there has been a huge reallocation of beds and personnel to increase ICU capacity. That's just an example, but I was wondering that in some places, some other places, it might happen that too.
Well, what I know is that there has been a reallocation of like ventilators, for example, across states. Some states were in March, like in Ohio, where the epidemic was not particularly, Ohio or Oregon, I forgot. Sorry. The epidemic was not, particularly strong. They offered and they transferred ventilators to, say, New York at the time when, in New York State, the epidemic was ravaging. So you can interpret that, for example, as effectively relaxation of the ICU constraint. But
yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. We'll look into that.
Okay, thanks.
So let me move to household. So period utility has these two components, U and V. U is the utility of consumption, and V is the utility of labor. So the function U takes as argument C, which is regular consumption, S, which is social consumption, and H, which is on production. And the disutility V takes argument LW, which is workplace hours, LR, remote hours, and there should be here an LH, but LH is equal to H, so the production function of on production is H equal to LH, so we substitute it directly. Notice these two epsilon here, epsilon S and epsilon W, which are a function of the D dot, which are the flow of dots, which are essentially these utilities. These are these utility of kind of infection risk from consuming the social good and from working on site. Okay? So this is how basically the epidemic feeds into behavior and into economic activity. Okay? An increase in that is going to increase the utility of consuming the social good and of working on site, and it's going to have an impact on choices. the budget constraint of a household working in occupation J is kind of, this standard budget constraint that I, as you remember, explained 2 weeks ago with the law of motion for B and A, which is kind of standard. This is after tax earnings. Tau is the tax rate, W is the wage rate of occupation J, Z is efficiency units of labor, and then the individual can choose between LW and LR. The key parameter here is phi J. Phi J is a flexibility index for occupation J. So phi equal to 1 would be like a very flexible occupation, like our occupation that that we can perform pretty much entirely from home, research, okay, where this phi would be very close to 1. Another occupation would be at the opposite end of the spectrum, would be something like exactly like a nurse, for example, where you really have to be on site to work, and this phi would be 0. So I'll tell you later how we parameterize this phi function. This is the flow of interest income from the liquid assets: transfers, regular consumption, social consumption with PS being the relative price, deposits, adjustment cost, transaction cost, and this is the law of motion for the liquid asset, where D is again deposits into the liquid asset. Okay. This is for a healthy individual. So what we assume here is that an individual cannot. We assume there are no tests available, okay, or at least there are no tests in the model up to this point, and an individual can only recognize that he's sick from COVID if he needs to be hospitalized. Okay, so the only 2 relevant states for the individual that affect his decision are either C, either is critical, or is in any of the other states. Any of the other states, we call them healthy, in the sense the individual can still work. If the individual is is hospitalized, then it cannot produce, not work, and the government provides a minimum amount of like C lower bar and S lower bar. So there is a different problem for the critically ill individual, but I'm not going to show it. It's kind of trivial. Okay, so this completes kind of the household. Okay, so households basically, they can save in these two assets, and they can make these consumption and labor supply choices, which are very rich, and they are affected by the epidemic when they make their consumption and labor supply decisions. So the occupations in the model, they differ along 3 dimensions. The first dimension is flexibility, as I said. Okay, flexibility means essentially the degree of substitutability between on-site work and remote work. They differ in the intensity in which they are used in the social and regular sector, and they differ whether they're essential or not. An essential occupation is an occupation that is basically is deemed critical, and so even during lockdown, these individuals, they continue working. Here's a kind of a taxonomy of occupations. Okay, so again, they can be high flexibility or low flexibility, so flexible or rigid, high intensity in C, high intensity in S, or essential. Let me start with the essential occupations. The essential occupations examples are policeman, a nurse, or a supermarket clerk. And then you have like this 2x2 matrix of the other types of occupations. A C intensive flexible occupation would be someone like a software engineer or an architect. A flexible occupation, which is high intensity in S, would be like a social scientist or or a university professor or an event planner. Okay, so the difference between these two groups is the following. The difference is that, you know, all these guys can basically work from home, but the ones in this group here, they're hit by the decline in, possibly declining demand for the goods or service they produce. Okay, think about like the event planner. The event planner is someone who can definitely, you know, plan an event from home, but if there's nobody who's getting married, then there's not much work they can do. The low flexibility types, again, they can be like intensive in the C sector or S sector. For example, you know, examples of flexibility, low flexibility occupations which are high intensive in the C sector are kind of a car mechanic or a miner, and in the S sector are a waiter or a shop assistant. Okay, none of these can work remotely, and on top of that, these guys are even in absence of a lockdown, they would be hit by a decline in the demand for the particular good or service they produce. Okay, so turning to flexibility, the effective labor supply of an occupation is given by the total labor supply in the workplace by the top plus the total labor supply remotely times this flexibility index. Okay, as I explained earlier. In terms of employment intensities, essentially, you know, we're going to have like these two sectors, the C and the S sector, which are indexed by I, each one with a kind of a Cobb-Douglas production function in between capital and labor. And this labor aggregator N is a CS aggregator of the 5 types of occupation. But we're going to have 5 types of occupations. So J, capital J is going to be 5, with relative intensity, as I explained, relative intensity Xi, and elasticity of substitution across the 5 occupations equal to sigma. And I assume that sigma is the same in the 2 sectors. Okay, so this is a production structure basically that allows for, you know, imperfect substitutability across these occupations and heterogeneity in the degree of intensity in which these occupations are used across the 2 sectors, the C sector and the S sector, which is important, again, for the distributional impact of the shock. Any question on this occupational structure? That's kind of key.
Just one clarification question, Gianluca.
Sure.
This, what's the value of sigma here? So are complements or substitutes?
They're gonna be slightly substitutes. It's gonna be like 1.25. And
okay.
we sort of choose this number to match the relative drop in earnings across occupations in the US.
I see. Okay. And all of these type of workers or occupations are going to be so the complementarity between these type of occupations with capital are going to be the same.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. No, I mean, for sure, you can you know, you can write down like richer production structures, and to some extent, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of, you know, capital being more complementary with certain types of workers than others, but it's kind of very complex to identify the elasticities. You know, one of the reasons why it's more complex than for educational levels is because educational level is a fixed component, while individuals can move across occupations. You know, so it's harder to think about like instruments and so on. But that's for now. That's what we do.
Perfect. Thanks.
Absolutely. Okay. So let me talk about lockdowns now. Okay, so this is basically the production cycle. What does it mean to lock down the economy? Again, we have two types of lockdown: what we call the social sector lockdown and the workplace lockdown. The social sector lockdown is a mandated, sort of a compelled, essentially mandated decrease in capital utilization in the S sector. Okay, that's what it is. And I think that's what it is in reality. That's what it is in the model. It's the government that says basically, to restaurants, you can only use like 1/3 of your capacity, or you have to close down completely. Okay, or you can only use your tables outside. Okay? The workplace lockdown is effectively a limit on the number of hours, on-site hours, on the number of hours that individuals can spend at work. Okay, the government can say you can go to work 1 day a week, no more than 1 day a week. In the U.S. In many other places, there was really like a full shutdown of non-essential business. So this kappa L parameter would be 0. Okay, we express it as a share of total hours instead of like the absolute because it's more convenient analytically, but it's kind of the same idea. Okay, so kappa S and kappa L are policy parameters that determine the intensity of the lockdown. Kappa S, kappa L equal to 0 is a full lockdown. Kappa S, kappa L equal to 1 is an economy with no lockdown. Now, one important point here that I want to make is that, you can see immediately here that the lockdowns are going to reduce infections because they reduce activity in the S sector, and they reduce the amount of work hours in the workplace. Okay, so they basically affect the same behavioral margins as the epidemic, right? Because the epidemic by itself has this utility component. Remember, going back to, let me go back to this slide here, as this utility component that make individuals cut their consumption of the S good and cut on-site work, okay? Which in terms of the feedback acts exactly as a reduction in C and a reduction in L. So you have to keep this in mind. But is kind of slightly different, at least the economics is somewhat different because in one case, in the epidemic, it's coming from the demand side. This is really like it's kind of a supply or productivity effect on productivity, right? These are like, you can see that these are kind of productivity shocks, basically. Okay, especially with Cobb-Douglas, they essentially isomorphic to a reduction in TFP, which is kind of, I think we like this analogy. We really like this analogy that lockdown are basically productivity shocks. Any question here on the lockdown? Good. Okay. So the remaining model ingredients are kind of standard. So we have a continuum monopolistic intermediate good producers, which are used by the final producers of good C and good S. We have this structure because eventually we want to look at sticky prices, but in the baseline we have flexible. In the model I'm going to present today, we have flexible prices. Then we have an investment fund that owns the aggregate capital stock and owns the intermediate producers in the C and the S sectors. And what households do, they trade shares of the investment fund, and that's the liquid asset. Okay, that's the way we model the liquid asset. The government issues liquid debt. This is the liquid asset in the economy, spends, taxes, and transfers. And then we have in the background a central bank, which again, in the model with sticky prices would dictate monetary policy. But here in this flex price model, all it does basically, it kind of absorbs the additional debt needed to finance fiscal policy, okay? So we're assuming that the government, the central bank in particular, is sitting on a pile of goods that has accumulated in the past, and that when the government needs to finance the expenditure and transfers to households. It issues that, and what the central bank does, it buys that and it gives these goods to the government for to implement the fiscal policy. And this is kind of very much in line with the what the role of central banks in this crisis. What they did, basically, they kind of absorbed most of the debt issuances of governments around the world in order to avoid basically the spike in interest rates that would have been kind of necessary and unavoidable if it was like the private sector that had to absorb this additional debt. Okay, to conclude, this is the summary of market clearing conditions. The regular good market clearing condition, it says that basically the output in the C sector is equal to consumption, investment, expenditures, and these are just the transaction costs. So we denominate investment and expenditures in the C good. The C good is the numeraire. The social good market clears. The labor market in each of the 5 occupations clears, which means that basically, the demand for occupation J by firms producing in the 2 sectors is equal to the effective supply, which is efficiency units times labor produced in the workplace and remotely. And these are, I wrote here what are the state variables for an individual, which is the health status, illiquid asset, liquid assets, and productivity integrated over the equilibrium distribution. The liquid asset market clears, so the holdings of liquid asset by households are equal to the government holdings, and the liquid asset market clears, which is a condition that states that the value of the asset holdings in the economy by households is equal to the value of the fund, basically, which depends on the capital stock and on the shares. These are the shares of the equity, basically, in the C sector and the S sector, which is normalized. The number of shares are normalized to 1 in equilibrium, and the capital stock in the economy is equal to the capital stock demanded by the firms in the C sector and the S sector, and assume that capital is perfectly mobile across sectors. Also, labor is perfectly mobile across sector, okay, in each occupation. So we assume that how individuals cannot switch occupation, okay, but they can switch sector, which in practice means they can switch occupation, basically, right? Because they cannot switch occupation group, but within occupation group they can go from sector C to sector S. Okay, so for example, let me go back here. Okay, so like a car mechanic, so say a shop assistant, okay, who loses her job in the S sector could become a car mechanic. Okay, so we allow for some occupational mobility, effectively, which I think is important. It does exist in the data. Okay, that's the model. Any question? So I have about like 35 minutes, right?
Yes, around 35 minutes. Perfect.
Any question?
I think there is no question for the audience so far.
Okay, good. So, parameterization. Okay, so the 3 key aspects of the parameterization are the epidemiological block, the occupational parameters, and this 2-way feedback from infection to economic behavior. Okay, so for the epidemiological block, we're using various epidemiological and clinical studies. Occupational parameter, I'm going to explain it, but basically we take the flexibility measures from ONET, sectoral employment intensity from the OES, the occupational employment study, and the earnings and liquid wealth per occupation from SIP. For this kind of 2-way feedback, from the feedback from economic activity to infections, we're going to use the observed drop in R0 after the lockdown. And from infections to economic activity, we're going to use kind of the VSL, the Value Statistical Life Literature. Okay, try to explain this in the next like 10 minutes or so. Okay, so these are the key parameters of the AP block of the model. Okay, so okay, so in particular, we are sorry, let me just go. Okay, so I have to explain it. Okay, so we're going to start from like an R0, which is the basic reproduction number of 2.5, which is kind of a standard number. But we're also going to assume that people learn. People learn, you know, to wear masks. They learn to wash their hands. They learn to avoid crowds, to, you know, avoid like throwing birthday parties at home and so on. Which means that eventually the basic reproduction number exogenously over time falls from 2.5 to 1.5. Okay, this is something that again the AP literature has emphasized. These are standard average duration of infections and exposure periods. In terms of the fatality rate, we're going to assume basically that every infected individual has a 2% probability of becoming critical, and then conditional on being critical, it dies with an ICU, it dies with a probability of like 33%. Okay, so the death, so like 1/3, probability 1/3. So the overall infection fatality rate is like there should be like another zero here. Sorry, 0.0066. Okay, so 0.66%. Without an ICU, you die with probability 1. So what are the naive dynamics of the epidemic? By naive, I mean, if you just basically feed in these parameters, abstracting completely from the behavioral feedback, okay? Well, these are kind of the standard dynamics of the epidemic, okay? Particular, you know, here the herd immunity threshold in this model is like around 60%. Initial herd immunity is 60%. And you see here that you get the typical like overshooting behavior, where 60% would be here, but then there is another like, you know, almost like 30% of people that become infected over time, which is like the typical overshooting of these SIR models. At peak, it would be like around 9% of people who are infected, and you know, this is the number of critical people. This is the ICU capacity of like 60,000 units. There would be like a massive ICU overload, which would lead to cumulatively to like 1.6% death rate, which is obviously a lot of that. You know, with an adult population of like 250 million, this would be like something like 4 million people. Okay. Now these are super dire prediction of the model that we know now they're crazy because they're missing like the behavioral feedback. Okay, but this is just to give you an idea. Okay. This is the behavioral feedback. Okay, and you know, as I explained, this beta T component here, it's the exogenous decline in the transmission rate that comes from this learning about you know, wearing masks and so on. But then the way we model the feedback from economic activity to the epidemic is with sort of this specification here, where we are assuming basically that an increase in consumption in the social sector and an increase in labor in the workplace translates into a lower transmission rates with elasticity, like newbie. Okay, And how do we calibrate nu B? Well, we say, look, the estimates of RT is basically beta T divided by lambda I. Okay, so essentially it's beta T. Drop from 2.5 to 0.8 after the lockdown. The lockdown, you can see, reduces C and L by roughly 50%, okay? Which, if you want to get a decline of basically beta T from, of this size, you need an elasticity of 0.8. So we set nu B this way. Okay, so we're thinking basically of these as being exogenous because they're imposed by the government, and that allows us to estimate the nu beta. Okay, very good. Let me turn to occupations now. So first thing we do, we classify the 3-digit NAICS industries as regular or social this way. So this is like from the classification from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. You see basically, I let you read these two columns yourselves, but it's kind of very intuitive. The classification, we think the S sector as basically is like 1/4 of the economy, and the C sector is 3/4 of the economy. In particular, you have here like arts and entertainment, accommodation, food service, transportation, trade, retail trade, and so on. How do we classify occupations? So we start from the 430 3-digit occupation from the OES. We identify the essential ones from Brookings. Brookings as a publication where it lists like the essential occupations. Then we rank the non-essential ones by the flexibility index, high or low. Then we rank them independently by the relative intensity in C versus S, so how much employment they have in the C sector or the S sector. So we end up with these five occupational groups, and then for these 5 occupational groups, we compute average earnings and liquid wealth from C. Okay, and this is kind of what we get. Okay, so these are the acronyms for the 5 types of occupations: E essential, CF, C intensive, flexible, and so on. And these are the levels of fee that we assume for each of them. So for the flexible, we assume 1 basically, and for the others, we assume 0.1, meaning that we allow them basically, to be somewhat productive remotely, but basically they would lose like 90% of their productivity. We don't go all the way to 0 because arguably there are some occupations here where you can maybe be productive from home. Okay. Then these are the intensities in each of the 2 sectors. So you see that there are some occupations that are, they're kind of mostly really very polarized. But for example, the essential occupations, they're present both in the C sector and the S sector. So, the key essential occupation in the S sector would be like healthcare, and here it would be, for example, policemen. In terms of employment shares, it's kind of interesting. It's only like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Okay, 1/3 essential occupations, 1/3 flexible, 1/3 rigid, or you could say like 1/3 essential occupations, and then of these like 1/3 in the C sector and 1/3 in the S sector. So they're all like big. Average earnings, these are average earnings, yes, average earnings. This is what they are, and you see that basically the rigid occupations, in particular the CR and SR, are the ones with the lowest average earnings. In particular, the SR occupations are the ones with the lowest average earnings. 30,000 vis-a-vis like 80,000, which are the CF occupations. So these are the low-skilled people. And these are median holdings of liquid wealth. You see they're very skewed. There are these CF occupations that they hold a lot of liquid wealth, but the rigid occupations, these are median holdings, okay? Like the liquid wealth distribution is very skewed. So there is the means are very different from the medians. But what matters really for us in terms of like welfare are the medians. So like 50% of the individuals in these occupations has less than, for example, $1,000. We really want to try to match these occupations features, all of them, in particular the liquid wealth. And so in order to do that, we add an occupation-specific wedge in the Euler equation for the liquid rate. Okay, so that and this kind of helps. The wedge that come out are something like between like 1% and 2% annual, in order basically to match this kind of holdings of liquid wealth. And the idea is that you can think of that in many ways. One is like financial literacy, access to financial institutions, and so on. Okay, is this clear? So in the end, going back to a question was asked earlier, this is kind of the way we can get in the model, all these features of the occupational structure that are really important. Okay, so finally, let me talk about the last bit, which is the key feature of the calibration, which is the feedback from the epidemic into the disutilities in preferences. Okay, these sort of preference shifters. This is the way we parameterize the preference shifter. Okay? Basically, as a function of death rate, so individuals see daily deaths, they see deaths going up, and they freak out. They don't like to go to restaurants, they don't like to go to work. Okay, that's kind of the idea. So how do you parameterize these utilities here? Well, one advantage of the specification here is that it maps into the value statistical life calculations. You can see that immediately from the optimality condition for hours worked, which looks like this. Okay, where I have rearranged it so that it looks like a relationship between log wage, and this X would contain log hours and consumption. Okay, but what I'm interested in is the fact that this first order condition tells you basically a relationship, kind of an indifference, if you like, curve between monetary compensation and death risk. Okay, D dot. These are the equations, exactly the equations that are used to estimate the monetary compensation for fatality risk. Okay, so in this case, like an additional, suppose this, I'll come back to this, but suppose this like nu L is 1. Okay, so this is a linear equation. Then suppose that we go to the literature, then we know in the literature we can estimate what is the compensation, basically the compensating differential across occupation for different levels of fatality risk. And in this equation, it will be given by the product by gamma and nu. Gamma is a combination of like preference parameters, okay, whose values we know. Will be like the free elasticity, and something else. But we need to estimate these two parameters, nu0L and nu0 and nu1L. Now, this relationship here tells us that if nu L1 is less than 1, the compensation is increasing, obviously, but concave in death risk. Okay, which is actually what comes out from the literature. The literature on the value of statistical life tells you that the marginal compensation for additional fatality risk falls with the level of fatality risk. Okay, it's increasing but concave again. All right. So basically, what we do, we choose these two parameters to generate value of statistical life between 4 and 10 millions for fatality rates between 1/1,000 and 1/10,000 per quarter. And this is like the relevant range for COVID-19 in the US, because basically the quarterly death rates for COVID-19 in the US has been of the order of 1 over 2,500. 1 over 2,000, 1 over 3,000. Okay, it's kind of in between these two fatality rates. All right, so okay, this is a bit complex, but basically the idea is that, you know, these preference shifters are we think are a good way of specifying this feedback, because they map into this value statistical life calculation, and then we can use numbers from the value statistical life calculation to parameterize it. Okay. Questions? Good. So then let me move to the experiments. Okay. So I'm gonna sort of show you like three types of experiments. One, which is kind of a laissez-faire, which is basically counterfactual without public health or fiscal policy. Then a lockdown only, which is a counterfactual without fiscal policy, and then lockdown plus fiscal policy, which is the actual US scenario. And in every one of these scenarios, I'm going to assume that the vaccine arrives after 24 months and is distributed very rapidly. So this is maybe a bit pessimistic, but we actually don't really know. Okay, we know that Russia has a vaccine, but it's probably not extremely effective.
Gianluca?
Yeah.
This is Ernesto Paston.
Yes.
So a quick clarification question is, the monetary policy, or what the central bank is doing in this model, what is actually doing on households? Does it have a direct effect on households, and what it is?
All the central bank does is absorbing. It absorbs basically all the debt that the government is issuing. Okay, so basically what it means that it kind of stabilizes the interest rate. Okay.
Okay. So prevents the interest
rate. Imagine it's like imagine it follows like an interest rate targeting rule, sort of. Okay. It wants to keep the interest rate constant. And so when the government issues new debt, it's just going to take all the new debt.
Okay, so in one line, it prevents the increase in the interest rate due to more public spending.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
It does, which I think is a good approximation of what central banks have done. I mean, they've done other things, but this is one of the things that they did. Okay. Very good. So some results, okay? So I'm going to show you some plots like this, where you have like a bunch of variables, and you know, you can look at them and kind of pick your favorite to analyze. But fundamentally, you have on the first line the dynamic of the epidemics, and then some aggregates here. Okay, this is the laissez-faire. Okay, this is like Sweden, if you like. Okay, so what you see basically, you see clearly a drop in R0, which is entirely due to the behavioral response of households. There's no lockdown here. A spike in infections, and you get precisely the drop in R0 because you have this spike in infections. You know, spike in death rates, obviously, which exceed the ICU constraint. So here the ICU constraint would be binding over this period here for like 3 months. You get a sharp drop in output, which is driven by the sharp drop in the consumption demand for the social good. And there is a slight increase in the demand for the regular good, but it's basically constant. And why is there no more substitution? Well, because remember that when the social good falls, consumption of social good falls, what households do, they consume into home production, okay? And you can see here that on hours, they really spike. They increase by 50%, okay? So the bundle of, you know, social good and home produced good doesn't change very much. And then means that also regular consumption doesn't have to change very much. Investment falls, right? And it's interesting, you get this, you know, you get this sort of co-movement between consumption and investment. The reason why investment fall pretty sharply, like 5%, is because the epidemic basically induces a drop in productivity, labor productivity. You know? Again, because rigid occupations, they cannot really switch into remote work, and so there's a decline in an effective decline in the productivity of the remote. Of the rigid occupations, because they cannot really switch productively to remote work. Okay, so it's this decline in productivity that leads to the co-movement within consumption and hours. But one thing that I want to emphasize, because it's going to be important later, is that you see the recession is sharp, but pretty short-lived. Okay, meaning that like the big drop in output lasts for like 2-3 months, and then that's it. The economy recovers. Okay.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
I know that the model, Ernesto Pastel again, sorry. I know that the model is quite complicated the way it is, but I am wondering whether frictions in the labor market, such that unemployment may enter meaningfully, and destruction of labor contracts may enter in a meaningful way to generate some inertia, may change some of the quick recovery.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think that if you had like firm-specific human capital, for example, or some specific human capital, that would certainly slow down the recovery. Because you kind of, it's like a stock that falls significantly, possibly because of the destruction of, as I said earlier, like viable employment relationships, and they would slow down the recovery. Yeah, I think.
And probably also there's going to be a feedback through aggregate demand, because if people think that if they lose a job, they're not may recover their income quickly, then they may become more precautionary in advance. Yeah,
I just want to point out something that it's not like here the recovery is, the recovery is relatively fast relative to the lockdown case that I'm going to show you in a second. But look, the scale is a bit misleading. There is a drop of output of like something like 14%, and then say you go 6 months later, okay, which is April, like October, and the economy is still like 4% below steady state. So 4% usually we would consider like a large recession, right? So there is persistence built in here anyway, which comes from the fact that again there is this prolonged drop in demand because of the infections. Okay, so going to the distributional implications, okay, so you first see exactly what you would expect, right? That the C-intensive occupations, they are not hit very hard, because what happens mostly is a decline for the S-good. And it's like the S-intensive occupations that are dropped, that are really hit very hard, okay? Because this is really like a sectoral shift in demand. The drop in total consumption is much more uniform, you can see them from earnings. And the reason is essentially that everyone cuts down on social consumption anyway. So total consumption falls. Also, you have the fact that the richer households, which are the ones basically in the FC and the FS occupations, they see a drop in asset values, so the share price drops, and that's like a negative wealth effect that reduces consumption. So that's kind of the other reason. But fundamentally, the reason is that everyone cuts down on social consumption. But keep in mind this sort of the fact that the laissez-faire implies that the C-intensive occupations, they're not hit very hard relative to the other ones. Okay, let me now move to the lockdown. So I'm going to add the lockdown on top of this. Okay, the lockdown again has these two components: a workplace and a social good lockdown. These are, the kappas basically that are calibrated to obtain a decline in workplace and retail activity similar to the one in the Google data that I showed you earlier. Okay, we're also assuming no future lockdown in case of a second wave. And here's what you get, okay, with the lockdown. The shaded area here is the lockdown. So the first thing that you notice is that you do get a second wave with the lockdown that you were not getting in the laissez-faire. And the reason why you get a second wave is because basically the lockdown is very effective, okay, at sort of compressing the number of infections. You can see that the infection here, they peak at 0.6% as opposed to 1.5% in the laissez-faire. They're very effective. But the exit from the lockdown is very abrupt, like in the US, it was very abrupt. And so this means that after a while, you get a second wave. The second wave implies that you get a W-shaped recession. Okay? You get a big drop first and then a second one later. Again, big drop in social consumption and drop in investment. But what is interesting is kind of how the first recession differs from the second, right? Because the first recession is a lockdown-driven recession. So it's kind of a supply-driven recession. The second recession, there's no more lockdown, is a demand-driven recession. Okay? And you can see from this drop, this panel here, that the drop in productivity is much more substantial in the first recession. So the lockdown is really terrible for productivity. Also the demand driven, but the lockdown is really terrible. And you can see it in investments, okay? I mean, investment, they really tank in the first recession, but not so much in the second. So that's kind of the key difference here is sort of the second. Oh, okay, besides being the magnitude, I'll show you the magnitude later, is the second wave. Right, here's a comparison of the magnitude. Okay. There's this very distinct dynamics of the monthly death rates between the laissez-faire and the lockdown. You see distinct shape of the recession. In particular, the recession here is, besides being like W-shaped, is deeper and is longer. Okay, but also you see the different distributional effects. Okay, what the lockdown does, it really really imposes like a very, very large economic cost for all the occupations, but in particular for the C-intensive occupation relative to the laissez-faire. Okay? The C-intensive occupations have labor income losses that are like twice as big in the full lockdown relative to the laissez-faire. So that's the other big difference in terms of like distribution implications.
Sorry, just a quick question.
Sure.
In terms of the total number of deaths, between the two things. Could you tell us what they are?
Yeah, I can tell you later. I'll tell you later because I have a plot with this kind of pandemic possibility frontier. So let me postpone that.
Okay, perfect.
I just have a quick question. I'm missing why there is no an investment boom at some point.
Sorry, say it again.
I am missing why there is no investment boom at some point in the future. Because capital keeps depreciating. At some point, it has to catch up, no?
Well, but productivity is still very low, you see? The reason is that productivity is still very low. So there might be an overshooting of investment down, like around here, later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Eventually there will be one, but it's
eventually
okay.
There will be one. Eventually one. That's a very good point. Very good point. I'm gonna check. Yes, I agree. I agree because eventually productivity goes back. The capital stock is lower than steady state, and so it has to go up. Because there are no like permanent effects here. I mean, they're very long-lived though, because also the tax rates changes, but eventually there should be one. Yes, I agree. Okay. I talked about this. Okay, so let me talk about the composition of the lockdown between social sector and workplace. Okay, so here the orange line is the full lockdown, the green line is the social, and the red line is the workplace lockdown. Okay, so the first thing that you see is in terms of deaths. So the social sector lockdown is actually, you compare the green line with the red line. Okay, the orange line is the sum of the two, basically, is the combination of the two. You see that, so the green line, eventually has more deaths than the red one. So the red one is much more is really effective in reducing death rates, but no, not that many, because in fact the green line doesn't have like the second wave. Okay, but in terms of output, you see that essentially all the loss in prosperity caused by the lockdown is associated with the workplace lockdown, not so much the social lockdown. The social lockdown has a large effect by itself, but this is all kind of coming from the workplace lockdown. And the reason is that the workplace lockdown is really the source of the big drop in productivity, aggregate productivity in the economy. You also see that the social lockdown, while basically having pretty much the same consequences for the S-intensive occupations, is much better for the C-intensive occupations, obviously, because in particular the rigid occupations, because these guys can keep going to work. Okay? So that's another point that it's been made in the literature, and I think it's novel here. That it's important to distinguish these two aspects of the lockdown, and the social lockdown as some aspects that are kind of very desirable. Okay, here's like a summary of what I said so far, and some additional lockdown experiments. This is what we call the pandemic possibility frontiers, where we have like death rates on the x-axis, percentage of the population, and this is basically the welfare cost, which is computed as multiples of monthly income. Okay, this is basically multiples of monthly income that an individual would be willing to pay at the beginning of the transition to avoid the epidemic. Right? So this solid line is the mean. This is the laissez-faire point. This is the US lockdown. This is a 12-month lockdown. This will be like a 70-month lockdown. Obviously, it's negatively sloped. as you would expect. Okay, the laissez-faire has small economic welfare costs, but a higher number of deaths. A very long lockdown with a very small number of deaths, but will be very costly. What we want to show here is not just the mean, but basically the entire distribution of welfare costs. Okay. Okay. So let me explain a few things about this plot. The first one I want to explain is that the pandemic possibility frontier has, as a slope that is relatively flat here, okay, which means kind of favorable to the lockdown. Then it becomes very steep and then kind of flat again, okay? So a steep slope means that increasing the length of the lockdown is a bad policy. A flat slope, it means that it's a good policy, relatively laissez-faire, because you can reduce the number of deaths without much welfare cost. And why is it the case? Well, at the beginning, the reason why lockdowns are very, very good is because they essentially prevent the ICU constraint from binding. Okay, so as long as the ICU constraint is potentially binding, you can really save a lot of lives. At this point here, which happens to be actually the duration of the US lockdown, as you keep increasing the lockdown, the ICU constraint is not binding anymore. It's not binding anyway. And so you're saving lives, but kind of the trade-off becomes much more unfavorable. Then something else happens, okay? What happens is that, that the vaccine is arriving. The vaccine is arriving like in 24 months. So at this point, if you increase marginally the duration of the lockdown, essentially what happens is that you're kind of gaining time until the vaccine arrives, and so you can save a lot of lives because you're basically avoiding a large number of infections until the vaccine is there, and when the vaccine is there, you can save lives. That's why you have like these three regions here. The other thing that I wanna emphasize here is that the distributional effects of the lockdown are quite unequal. Okay, I mean, even in the laissez-faire, even for short lockdowns, you get kind of on average, say, like 3 months of income in terms of welfare costs, but they vary between like 1 and 4. Okay, and the longer is the lockdown, the more unequal these costs are, because up here you have like these sort of these rigid occupations that they basically cannot work for like 16, 17 months, and they have like really, really large welfare costs. Okay, any question on this? I'm running out of time. Okay, so let me quickly explain the fiscal policy experiments, and then I'll conclude. The last point is something that I can say in words. Okay, so the fiscal policy, the CARES Act in the US was composed by different elements. Okay, the 3 key elements were like checks, which are distributed to households, like $1,200 basically to everyone. What is called the pandemic and employment insurance, which basically replaced the earning losses of individuals, and it was very generous. Ganon and Vavra documented actually at low deciles of the income distribution, replacement rates were way above 100%. And then there was this kind of paycheck protection program, which was essentially money given to firms in order to retain their employees on payroll. Okay, but this program actually was very criticized because there is a lot of moral hazard there in this policy, because basically a firm can say, yeah, I'm going to retain my employees if you give me the money, okay, but you never know whether they would have retained the employees anyway, right? So the way we the way people think about this program is basically part wage subsidy to the firm and part profit subsidy, basically. Because if you have retain the workers anyway, it's kind of it's a subsidy to the owner of the firm. Okay, so we model it as like 50% wage subsidy, 50% profit subsidy. And let me just quickly go through the effects of the policy. Okay, so you know, what you see here is like the effect on labor income. The blue line is no CARE Act, and the green line is full CARE Act. And the orange line is direct transfers to households, which is the check and the UI. The first thing you see is that one strong effect of the CARES Act was through the PPP. It increased labor earnings through the PPP because it's basically a subsidy to labor demand, okay, and a big effect. The second important aspect, which happens both because of the transfers and the PPP, is a support in consumption. Okay, strong support in consumption. You see, the consumption drop, say in May, would have been like 10% without the policy, and it's like 5% with the policy. And also, there's an effect on share price. Overall, what the fiscal policy does, it does exactly what we hoped it would do. It shifts the entire production possibility from, pandemic possibility frontier to, kind of southwest, okay? I mean, ideally, you would like to be here, right? You like a policy that takes you in this direction. And that's what the fiscal policy does, basically. It takes you like takes you in this direction. Certainly, it shifts the whole thing south. So it reduces welfare losses by roughly 20–25%. And does not increase deaths. It slightly decreases death. I can talk about this later if you like. Okay, very good. So let me just, can you give me like 1 minute and then I'll conclude. One fact that people thought was a bit puzzling at the beginning was that when they looked at like consumption data, okay, this is like data from national accounts on expenditures and saving. Okay, you see that the aggregate expenditures, they just they really dropped, and saving rate fell. Okay, but this was like in April. Okay, so this sort of traces this drop here, which is from credit card spending, in fact, sorry, debit card spending for 4 different income quartiles. You see like a uniform drop. But what you also see is that starting from mid-April, consumption recovers slightly, but it recovers much faster for the poor than for the rich. Okay, and this was considered to be kind of puzzling and connected perhaps to the fiscal policy precisely. Okay, and we show in the model that the fiscal policy does exactly that. Okay, this is the bottom quartile of the income distribution. This is the top quartile. Just focus on consumption. Okay, and compare the blue line with the green line. So no policy plus policy. The top quartile, there is a little bit of an improvement in consumption with the policy. You see that consumption recovers a bit faster, and not so much. But for the bottom quartile, you see the recovering consumption is much faster, and in fact, consumption goes even above steady state for a while. Okay, this is all because of the fiscal policy. We clarify obviously this kind of puzzle or semi-puzzling observation in the data by doing this counterfactual. And we really learned that US fiscal policy, in particular the cash transfers and the UI, were instrumental in sustaining the consumption expenditures at the bottom of the distribution. Okay, and that's it. Okay, So main takeaways so far, we have more work to do, but the laissez-faire, first, the laissez-faire has different distribution implication in the law. Okay, much better for the C-intensive occupation. The slope of this kind of health-wealth trade-off is far from uniform, and it kind of whether it's like flat or steep, it depends on the ICU constraint and the date of arrival of the vaccine. The social lockdown is much more effective in curtailing the epidemic than the workplace lockdown, because it doesn't really entail large economic cost and has big gains in terms of like life saved. Liquidity matters because the most exposed households are also the most vulnerable, and therefore they're the ones in need for social insurance. And social insurance did the right thing in the US, reduced the welfare losses without worsening the death count, and in particular the consumption of the poor, because of the fiscal stimulus, has recovered much faster. This is what we kind of learned so far from this analysis. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Gianluca. So I think we have maybe a couple of minutes for one or two questions. So if you have a question, please write in the QA chat, and we're gonna open the microphone for you. Maybe you have time just for one question. Okay, I think there are no questions from the audience. So thank you, Gianluca, for this great talk. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and it's been a pleasure to to be back, and thanks for the opportunity to present this work in progress. We'll probably post a version of the paper in the next couple of weeks once we're finished with this kind of last set of experiments that we're doing. So.
Great, thank you, and thank you everyone for attending today. And I kindly invite you to connect next week for another edition of the Central Bank of Chile webinars. Okay. So